Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the UBC Vancouver Celebrate Learning Week keynote session with Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani. My name is Christina Hendricks, and I'm the Academic Director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at UBC Vancouver. Dr. Jhangiani will be speaking to us today about designing for justice on navigating change as a critical pedagogue. And Celebrate Learning Week is a full UBC-wide event. So we begin today with land acknowledgements for both of the main campuses. The UBC Vancouver campus is situated on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam. And I am also joining from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam from my office on the UBC Vancouver campus. And for UBC Okanagan, we acknowledge the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their peoples in whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. So we may have folks joining us from the Lower Mainland in Vancouver, from the Okanagan region, or from various places. Our keynote speaker is joining us from Ontario today. So you may be joining us from even further afield, and I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands where we are each located. Celebrate Learning Week is a time for us to come together, to learn, to share, to celebrate many aspects of teaching and learning. And as we do so, even as we gather in a virtual space, I encourage us to keep in mind that we're each located, that we're teaching and learning, that we're working in physical spaces. And in many parts of Canada, those are on Indigenous traditional territories. The current UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan, launched in 2020, speaks to the importance of ensuring that Indigenous histories, experiences, worldviews, and knowledge systems are appropriately integrated into curricula. That's from Goal 4, and calls for professional development opportunities to help faculty and staff foster safe and inclusive classrooms and workplaces. That's from Goal 7. So I wanted to take this opportunity briefly to share some of the UBC programming that can help support these goals from the Indigenous Strategic Plan and other goals of that plan. So new this past year is the Indigenous Learning Pathways program, a set of 4 self-directed courses that supports meaningful and respectful engagement with Indigenous histories, knowledges, perspectives, and realities focused on UBC Vancouver, but also valuable knowledge for anyone. Also at UBC Vancouver, the CTLT Indigenous Initiatives team provides multiple resources, supports, workshops, and other things related to decolonization and indigenization in teaching and learning. At UBC Okanagan, the Center for Teaching and Learning's Indigenous Initiatives also provides support for Indigenous engagement in teaching and learning. And there's an Indigenous Reads Book Club at UBC Okanagan, which had a session at Celebrate Learning Week yesterday. So I'm afraid I can't announce it now for you to join later. So I also would like to share some general information about this session. Sorry. First, I would like to share just a reminder of UBC's Respectful Environment Statement. This is a quote from the Respectful Environment Statement, which says the best possible environment for working, learning, and living is one in which respect, civility, diversity, opportunity, and inclusion are valued. Everyone at UBC is expected to conduct themselves in a manner that upholds these principles in all communications and interactions with fellow UBC community members and the public in all university-related settings. So our goal today, particularly during the question and answer period, is to have engaging and respectful discussions about what the keynote speaker is sharing with us today. Now we move on to some general information. So as you may have already noticed, this session is being recorded. It will be posted on the CTLT YouTube channel and also on the Celebrate Learning Week wiki page. Closed captions are available for this session, and you can access them at the bottom of the screen where it says CC, Show Captions. You can also get a transcript there. And questions can be contributed through the Q&A function. The chat function is not available in this Zoom webinar, but you can add questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the Q&A for that as well. So a member from our events team will assist you directly. And for questions related to the keynote, submit those to the Q&A. We'll be addressing those at the end. And you'll be able to see all submitted questions in the Q&A window and be able to upvote ones that resonate with you. So again, we'll be collecting questions throughout the session, but we'll address them during the Q&A period at the end. I will now move on to introducing our speaker. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, who is the Vice Provost Teaching and Learning at Brock University, a proud UBC alum, and a passionate advocate for inclusive, student-centered education. A leader in open educational practices, he was the architect of Canada's first zero textbook cost degree programs and co-founded the Open Pedagogy Notebook. His work, recognized globally with multiple awards, bridges research, policy, and practice to create more accessible and equitable learning experiences. And we're thrilled to have him here today to speak on the topic of, the title of Dr. Jhangiani's talk is Designing for Justice on Navigating Change as a Critical Pedagogue. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that wonderful and thoughtful introduction. That's very kind of you. It's been a pleasure working with you for well over a decade at this point as well. And good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm just going to take a minute to share my screen and slides and make sure that you can see everything you need to as we embark on this fun 45-minute journey. As with the spirit of your introduction, Christina, as well, I do want to acknowledge I'm joining you, as you said, from Ontario, specifically from my office at Brock University, which is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, many of whom continue to live and work here today across the Niagara region. This territory specifically is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I also want to acknowledge that yesterday was Red Dress Day, as many of you know, the National Day of Awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. As a proud UBC alumnus, as Christina mentioned, I was honored for the invitation to speak today. And I confess, I was particularly struck by the welcoming and positive theme of this year's Celebrate Learning Week, because, of course, collective growth and meaningful change are exactly what we need at this time, along with collaboration, creativity, and I would say confidence in the transformative power of higher education. And I say this because, of course, the weekly news stories about layoffs and program closures at universities and colleges across the country are currently bearing witness to the reality that our sector is experiencing not collective growth, but collective contraction. This is in part due to the deeply damaging and unnecessarily blunt changes that were haphazardly introduced a year ago to federal policies concerning international student caps. In fact, in this recent news article in the CBC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada told them that the agency, as you see, cannot comment on the finances of educational institutions as adequate funding is a provincial and territorial responsibility, which in my mind is perhaps akin to an arsonist saying that they cannot comment on home insurance because ensuring adequate coverage isn't their responsibility. Now, as a former, not just UBC student, but a UBC international student, I confess that I balked at some of the rationale offered by our then Immigration Minister, Mark Miller, because, of course, governments across the country were for a very long time only too happy to encourage universities to recruit more international students to help make up for the dollars that they were unwilling to invest in the development of future talent. For example, back when I was teaching in the psychology department at UBC Vancouver in 2011, I remember Christy Clark, then Premier of British Columbia, setting a 50% growth target for international students across the province. But underfunding in higher education is not a tactic that's exclusively employed by conservative governments, as provincial government funding per student has actually been falling for most of the last 40 years, no matter which party has been in power. So I think what this really reflects is a weakening of societal recognition of the value of higher education. A little bit of data to share with you. If you look at the last decade, for example, total spending by provincial governments across the country on all matters has actually risen. It's risen by about 30% over and above inflation. It's their spending on post-secondary education that has flatlined and in fact dipped. And interestingly, if provinces had actually increased their investment in post-secondary education as much as they had increased their investments in pretty much everything else, that would have amounted to about $9.5 billion, which, according to an analysis by Alex Usher, is almost identical to the increase in income post-secondary institutions have seen in revenue from international students over the same period. So yes, international students have come to our shores at our invitation, benefiting from the education, the experience, and the pathway to immigration, while our nation, our society, and our sector have been enriched by their financing, by their labor, and of course, by their brilliance. As Yvonne Su from the Center for Refugee Studies at York University has pointed out, Canada's growing political theatre of scapegoating has cast international students as responsible for taking jobs, straining the asylum system, driving up housing costs, and increasing pressure on healthcare. And this kind of blame doesn't just alienate international students, it demonizes them as well. It risks exacerbating everyday discrimination, threats, violence, and even sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And while I think there's little doubt there have been real issues stemming from insufficient oversight from parts of the sector, particularly but not limited to the private-public partnerships at Ontario colleges, and issues concerning which have been known for some time, there is little doubt that the corrective response would have benefited from partnership or even consultation with those most affected. And this is but one of the principles of design justice. Now, of course, given the nature of the Canadian Constitution, our sectors had the added joy of being caught between changes in federal policies on international student caps and changes in provincial policies when it comes to higher education, including, for example, the performance-based funding that has been imposed in provinces such as Alberta, Ontario, and now Nova Scotia, or the language proficiency requirement that was imposed on out-of-province students in Quebec, only to be invalidated just over a week ago by a Superior Court judge. In other cases, it isn't so much official government policy as it has been prevailing government ideology that has driven change, as may be seen in the recent shift at the University of Alberta away from focusing on equity, diversity, and inclusion to perhaps thinking more palatably about access, community, and belonging. One can only imagine how much further this trend would have spread if the Conservatives had been elected in the recent federal election, given their leaders' self-described promise to put an end to the imposition of woke ideology in the allocation of federal funds for research. Now, of course, beyond the political pressures and threats facing our sector is the broader poly crisis that we are all living through on the heels of a major global pandemic, with tariffs and protectionism and ongoing political violence really taking attention away from widening societal inequities and climate action. I do feel the need to apologize for starting this talk with what feels like 5 minutes of doom and gloom over here. But to be honest, I do not believe we can realistically consider collective growth or indeed meaningful change without first honestly considering the challenges that are facing us collectively, or the nature and meaning of the changes that are being imposed upon us. So today, what I'd like to do is consider how we, both as individual educators and collectively as post-secondary institutions, can work towards growth and meaningful change, and how this might manifest when it comes to questions of teaching and learning at this time of rapid technological change as well. And in doing so, I want to draw on some of the most important lessons of the recent past while considering the more acute pedagogical challenges of the present. Note that many of the ideas I will present today will feature in a forthcoming chapter in the Research Handbook on Artificial Intelligence and Academic Integrity titled On Ethically Responding to Technological Change in Higher Education, from COVID-19 to Gen AI. And this is a chapter I co-authored with my partner, Rajiv Jhangiani, who of course is an Associate Professor of Teaching and the David Lamb Chair in Multicultural Education in the Faculty of Education at UBC Vancouver. So I want to start by looking in the rearview mirror and reflecting on the uncertainty and the unwanted destabilizing changes we all experienced 5 years ago. In particular, I would like us to consider some of the lessons offered by our experiences with pandemic pedagogies. As you will recall, when the COVID-19 pandemic and associated public health orders shuttered our campuses in March 2020, it forced a series of changes onto teaching and learning in higher education, all in the name of instructional continuity. You may remember that phrase. It necessitated the closure of formal teaching spaces such as classrooms and labs, as well as informal learning spaces such as libraries and student centers, whether or not educators or learners could continue their work effectively from home. It led universities and colleges to move all instruction online using tools such as the learning management system and video conferencing platforms, whether or not educators or learners were accustomed to these tools and delivery modes. It moved learning resources, activities, and assessments onto digital platforms, whether or not educators and learners had equitable access to necessary computing devices, peripherals, reliable high-speed internet access. And it did so as both instructors and students were grappling with uncertainty, with anxiety, with grief, atop the sudden loss of agency that resulted from these unwanted yet necessary changes. In my role as the Vice Provost Teaching and Learning, I would say to properly understand the magnitude of change brought about by emergency remote teaching is to regard with immense empathy and respect the thousands of instructors who moved online with little time, with no choice, and through, frankly, Herculean efforts, most of them teaching online for the first time. It is also to appreciate how drastically students were impacted, how many inequities were widened, and how much the resulting strain left social support networks, personal finances, and well-being in tatters. Now, there were several parallels between the experiences of instructors and students during this time. Right? Both had to quickly master new learning technologies in order to continue teaching or learning. Both had to find personal spaces that were amenable to this work. Both were desperately trying to balance academic and personal obligations. Both were trying to keep safe and healthy. Both benefited from flexibility. For example, at my institution, the student course withdrawal date was extended to the very last date of the semester, just as the grade submission deadline was extended for faculty as well. Both instructors and students experienced tremendous anxiety about how they would perform in what felt like a strange new environment, and both had to find ways to manage those anxieties when practices, well, especially when practices that alleviated anxiety for one group sometimes exacerbated anxiety for the other. Fortunately, faculty at many universities did not have to navigate these changes alone, as our Centers for Teaching and Learning, of course CTLT in the case of UBC, effectively operated as academic first responders during the pivot to remote emergency teaching. Instructional designers, teaching and learning experts, and multimedia developers, they collectively operated as Sherpas of online learning teams. In those early days of the pandemic, CTL staff were working, frankly, overtime and in overdrive, developing new workshops and guides while responding to thousands more requests for technical support and pedagogical consultations than ever before. As Sarah Eaton of the University of Calgary observed at the time, CTL staff literally rescued faculty members who otherwise would have been pedagogically paralyzed. As a result, many instructors managed to do what they might never have imagined possible. And although most faculty members would still prefer to teach face-to-face, the reality is that many quickly learned new instructional and delivery skills. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of post-secondary students across the country finished their courses and in many cases completed their programs because professors continued teaching. But of course, they didn't do it alone. Now, at the same time, both CTL staff and scholars of online learning understood well that there was an enormous difference between a well-designed online learning experience and the breathless rush to quickly transplant a campus-based course online. And it is precisely because, as Roland Moe observes, you can't teach someone to swim while they're drowning, that CTL staff focused on equipping faculty members with a foundational understanding of how they might approach emergency remote teaching in a way that would still provide a supportive learning environment for students. So they advised faculty members to retain what they needed, to trim what they didn't, to change what they had to survive the remaining weeks of the term. They urged instructors to extend flexibility and compassion to students and to be gentle with themselves in terms of expectations. They knew full well that the pivot was not going to look like graceful, synchronized swimming. It was about keeping afloat. This wasn't a sumptuous gourmet meal. It would approximate the meals ready to eat distributed by the Red Cross during a natural disaster. This is what I would regard as anxiolytic instructional design. In one of my favorite examples of this thoughtful guidance, Rebecca Barrett Fox implored faculty to please do a bad job of putting your courses online, with practical guidance that ranged from avoiding synchronous work requirements to not bothering with editing out the ums and ahs in video lectures. And in doing so, Barrett Fox reminded educators to be mindful of the broader context, wherein students would be accessing the internet from their phones, sharing technology with other household members, and even managing familial obligations amid job loss and social isolation. CTL staff were also vocal advocates for the adoption of more inclusive teaching practices, including but not limited to the principles of universal design for learning. As Brenna Clark-Gray, another leader in the BC sector, coordinator of educational technologies at Thompson Rivers University, wrote back in 2020, "My key role has been to advocate against," she said, synchronous timed exams, against lengthy video lectures, against requirements of synchronous participation. It's been for asynchronous participation options, for reflective writing and other open book assessment strategies, and really for generosity and compassion in course design. Now, somewhat surprisingly, emergency remote teaching did enable the normalization of certain inclusive practices, right? From recorded lectures and captioned videos to virtual office hours, things that students had been, and particularly students with disabilities, had long pleaded for and actually been denied. And as laptop loaner programs, parking lot Wi-Fi initiatives, and emergency food hamper programs were launched, several other inequities that were existing suddenly became more apparent to educators and to administrators, and so they were tackled with vigor. Nonetheless, as well-worn and comfortable learning activities and assessments didn't necessarily neatly translate online, the shift to remote instruction necessitated a shift in pedagogy, which caused some faculty to feel negatively about their remote teaching self-efficacy. But as Nafi and their colleagues point out, it wasn't just low self-efficacy, because the crisis led many faculty members to revert into a very deep conservatism. It was their attempt, perhaps, for a shred of control in a world drowning in uncertainty. Their teaching approaches presented a great deal of fidelity to face-to-face approaches, and the assessment approaches they adopted were, sometimes at least, problematic. Now, considering that many faculty members sought to retain as much as possible of what was familiar, it is no surprise that synchronous delivery and high-stakes online exams emerged as common instructional practices early in the shift to emergency remote teaching, despite the contrary evidence from CTLs. But as instructors who had ported their synchronous classroom pedagogies online, tired of speaking to a set of black boxes on Zoom, what might previously have been ableist laptop bans in the classroom were quickly replaced with ableist camera on policies online. And as rising reports of student cheating fueled concerns of widespread student academic misconduct during online exams, institutions faced loud calls for the implementation of systems that would enable control and surveillance of students. These practices, which ranged, of course, from lockdown browsers to the use of remote exam proctoring software, were a far cry from the earlier calls for flexibility, compassion, and kindness. This instead was an illustration of what Audrey Waters has described as carceral pedagogy. But as Vichy Sathi, co-author of Inclusive Teaching, Strategies for Promoting Equity in the College Classroom, has observed, sometimes the classroom is treated as something less than a sacred shared space, and more like a hostage situation. And this is perhaps most certainly the case when a pedagogy of care is sacrificed at the altar of rigor. Douglas Dowland thinks along similar lines when he writes that the rhetoric of rigor turns pedagogy into pathology, and further, that the world of rigor is not a world of correct and incorrect. It is a world of right and wrong. It is rigor's moralizing that should concern us, he says. And indeed, I think it is this moralizing that can lead to the concept of academic rigor being fetishized. It often manifests in the form of inflexibility, whether in terms of assignment deadlines, camera on policies, and even the denial of accommodations for students with disabilities, or the insistence on medical documentation or proof of a family member's demise to excuse a student absence. Jeffrey Morrow collectively labels these approaches as cop shit, which he collectively defines as any pedagogical technique or technology that presumes an adversarial relationship between students and teachers. As he explains, when a classroom becomes adversarial, of course, as cop shit presumes, then there must be a clear winner and loser. The student's education then becomes not a victory for their own self-improvement or enrichment, but rather the teacher conquered the student's presumed inherent laziness or shiftiness. And that's to instill some kernel of a lesson. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was perhaps no better example of cop shit on display than remote exam proctoring tools. These technologies, which usually required the installation of third-party plugins on students' personal devices, sought to monitor students while they were completing online assessments, quizzes or exams, for example. But they would record learners' bodies. They would track their eye movements as they sat in their bedrooms. And in addition to the obvious invasion of privacy of students' personal spaces that included room scans, video and audio recordings, the collection of browser history and personal computer information, the most damaging effects of these surveillance technologies were perhaps the ways in which they exacerbated inequities and amplified societal biases. For example, by penalizing or flagging students who needed to visit a washroom during an exam, the software reinforced ableism. And whether by not recognizing altogether or by disproportionately flagging as cheating those students with darker skin tones, the underlying algorithm reinforced racism. And this was all while the tools themselves had questionable efficacy in combating cheating during online exams, including because the students with greater means could more easily circumvent the surveillance. It was this collection of concerns that were underscored in eventual Senate discussions, both at my home university as well, of course, as at UBC, and that eventually led to prohibitions against the use of remote exam proctoring. I do want to take this opportunity, though, to pay tribute to one of our own, Ian Linkletter. Ian's tireless advocacy in support of ethical approaches to educational technology and whose legitimate academic critique of the practices of UBC's remote exam proctoring vendor led him to be sued as an individual by that very vendor for sharing unlisted, but not private, product videos on social media. Ian has and continues to be an incredibly important voice in the post-secondary community, and I think we all owe him a debt of leadership, of gratitude for his leadership. But looking back, I would say, even as I understand the pressures that led many post-secondary institutions to spend vast sums of money on educational technology vendor contracts in their search for the silver bullet that would kill online cheating, in my view, these are resources that would have been far better spent supporting instructors in the use of authentic assessment, in the design of more supportive and effective learning strategies and environments. Now, of course, in addition to the resources that were squandered by institutions, was the associated requirement for students to purchase webcams and laptops just when their employment options were shrinking and technology costs were rising. But none of these expenses, I think, came close to accounting for the true cost of creating adversarial learning environments that were predicated on a mistrust of students. Considering remote exam proctoring through the lens of what are known as the 6 fundamental values of academic integrity, I think this is an interesting way to look at it. You could consider, for example, the dishonesty represented by the poor efficacy of these tools, the unfairness of the algorithmic biases and widened inequities, the disrespect for personal privacy, the irresponsibility of ignoring data security breaches, the resulting erosion of trust as well. It strikes me, though, that it's really a perversion of the concept of academic integrity that surveillance technologies such as these were ever disguised in the costume of ethical decision-making. If anything, I believe that it took courage for institutions to resist the tide and to take a position against the use of surveillance technologies. But the grievous error of adopting remote exam proctoring wasn't the only lesson that we might have learned through this period of unwanted change. Because as Kathy Davidson and Diane Harris have written, from this horrific catastrophe, there are lessons that higher education can learn for itself. And in many ways, the pandemic helped educators to recenter their practices, reflect on their teaching philosophies. Instructors who took the opportunity to also become online learners, perhaps by enrolling in courses or workshops from their CTL, were reminded of the benefits of flexible deadlines, of a stripped-down set of required activities with the option to dive deeper when your interest is piqued. We are all reminded of the annoyance of being shunted into a breakout room for forced interaction, or the relief that one experiences when one is not required to keep one's camera on for the entirety of a synchronous session, just like this one. Instructors could experience the engagement and the sense of belonging that flows from feeling welcome and trusted, and conversely, the resentment that builds when one is compelled to engage in a series of activities that one understands as busy work. The experience of pandemic pedagogy, I think, also drove home the importance of not integrating technology for the sake of using a shiny new tool, no matter who else is using it, along with the importance of posing critical questions about technology adoption. Is the use of this technology necessary for students to achieve the learning outcomes? Is requiring this technology going to widen any inequities? What digital literacies does this technology presume? If the cost of the technology is borne by students and is more than nominal, is there a suitable cost-free alternative? How is student data safeguarded and where is this information held? And is this compliant with privacy legislation and the institutional intellectual property policy? I'm saying all of this because I know too often that legislative requirements like FIPA, for example, and associated procedures like privacy impact assessments are too often treated as the ceiling when it comes to ethical decision making with ed tech, when these elements should be the floor. As Anne-Marie Scott has astutely mused in this wonderful chapter, by the way, about ed tech procurement, we spend more time thinking about the ethics of buying tea bags at universities, fair trade, than we do technology. The pandemic also exposed the many ways in which the needs of our learners were not being met and how these inequities were being exacerbated, whether these related to accessibility, inadequate student funding, food, housing, financial insecurity, or even their physical or mental well-being. What was perhaps invisible to many could no longer be ignored. As Laura Chernovich has written, the pandemic made visible what should have never been ignored. And now that the impacts of the inequality are clear, are visible, they must never again be rendered unseen. There has been recognition of how many students face enormous barriers to learning. The diversity of learner settings and their associated challenges have started, she wrote, to receive proper attention. And yet, as the public health orders were rescinded and as campuses began to reopen, we witnessed an uncritical regression to the mean of those comforting pre-pandemic practices, or in some cases, malpractices. And along the way, we abandoned some of those gains made in areas such as accessibility and accommodations for students with disabilities. As Josh Eiler has written, students, faculty, and staff, everyone will remember the beneficial changes that institutions made during the pandemic, and they will wonder why these same institutions are going back to the way things were done in the before times, especially because the pandemic has revealed just how inequitable education was and remains. Now, no doubt, at least some of this regression was aided by the misleading comparisons made between the highly stressful experience with emergency remote teaching and the rosy retrospections made of familiar classroom-based instruction during optimal circumstances. But of course, the major reason for the backslide was a lessening of the severity of the public health emergency, and so it restored agency to both educators and institutions. But it meant that educators who had been trying for months to force the square peg of campus-based pedagogies into the round hole of the online environment no longer had to contend with the resulting friction. For example, those who had demanded that their students keep their camera on during online synchronous lectures could now go back to mandatory classroom attendance policies. And those who were drawn to tools such as remote exam proctoring could easily revert to invigilated on-campus exams. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that these cases represent the inclinations of the majority of post-secondary educators. But what does appear clear is that the post-secondary institutions across the board, with very few exceptions, generally retreated to pre-pandemic operations and policies. And so this meant not only the loss of some of the hard-won lessons of the pandemic, but also the lost opportunity to meaningfully redesign higher education in a way that would center inclusion, belonging, that would prioritize supports for the most marginalized, that would reinforce ethical decision-making in teaching and learning. And this lost opportunity meant that higher education was actually less equipped to thoughtfully respond to the next tidal wave of change in higher ed. And of course, I'm talking about the advent of generative artificial intelligence. Now, Gen AI and large language models have, of course, been in development for many, many years. But it was in November of 22 that these technologies took a bit of a leap forward with OpenAI's introduction of its ChatGPT platform. And with this one move, OpenAI catalyzed widespread awareness of the sometimes astounding contemporary capabilities of these new technologies, while also sparking an interesting AI arms race with pretty much every major technology company. Under pressure from their own venture capitalist investors, many edtech companies also rushed to see how quickly they could embed Gen AI into their own products or services. And that included vendors who style themselves as providing solutions to the problem of academic integrity, such as the behemoth Turnitin. And so post-secondary institutions once again found ourselves at the receiving end of unwanted change. We exercised our agency across a spectrum of responses that initially also included ignoring the new technology. But as the months wore on, and it became clear that the Gen AI genie was not going to go back into the bottle, everyone from government granting agencies and scholarly societies to research ethics board and professional journals began to share guidelines concerning when and where, how it might be appropriate to use Gen AI, where this use must be disclosed, what the implications were for intellectual property rights, authorship, institutional liability. When it came to teaching and learning, once again, CTLs came to the rescue, providing educators with a foundational understanding of these new technologies while helping address concerns about unauthorized use of AI by students to complete coursework. So we developed boilerplate language, right? It might be included in course syllabi. Guidance was shared about how to design more authentic assessments that would mitigate the threat of unauthorized use of Gen AI. And depending on the leaning of the instructors, the responses coalesce generally around either outlawing the use of Gen AI entirely or actively harnessing Gen AI in service of teaching and learning, latter including practices, everything from critically analyzing outputs of these platforms to having them create review questions. And I do want to acknowledge some of the excellent work that continues in this space, including with the development of tools like the AI assessment scale by Mike Perkins and his collaborators. Lots of good work taking place. Lucas Wright at CTLT at UBC has been doing wonderful work as well. At the same time, I want to highlight that what sometimes feels like a seemingly straightforward choice for educators, especially in the face of inevitability arguments raised in support of AI literacy for students, this sometimes sidesteps the more challenging ethical decision-making that I think is required. Is it ethical, for example, to require students to use platforms that engage in rampant theft of intellectual property, that do not provide transparency or even proper attributions? Is it ethical to lead students to a source of information that we know frequently hallucinates, spreading misinformation? Is it ethical to ignore the amplification of societal biases in output? Is it ethical to require students to use these tools when the cost barrier for higher levels of access will widen inequitable access? And is it ethical to use these tools in the classroom when one considers seriously the negative environmental impact of even a single query or prompt? To that last point, I will say when I was at an AI summit for higher education just last month in Calgary, I really appreciated in a presentation by Emily Simpson from Vancouver Community College, another UBC alumnus, the juxtaposition between the environmental impact of Gen AI use, which we, of course, often pay lip service to, and the seventh generation principle, which is a teaching known in many Indigenous communities and which encourages individuals and communities to specifically consider the long-term impact of their decisions on future generations, particularly 7 generations into the future. As Emily put it, when it comes to a single query with ChatGPT, whose 2 cups of water, clean water, am I using? I thought that was really powerful. But even if ethical reasoning leads instructors to avoid actively integrating Gen AI into classroom practice, reports and fears of widespread use of Gen AI in coursework led many to again demand that institutions procure tools that purport to detect the use of Gen AI in student coursework. And so just as the threat of online cheating during emergency remote teaching led some instructors towards control and surveillance and concerns about rigor, while others shifted to more authentic assessments, the threat of unauthorized use of Gen AI achieved about the same, with Gen AI detection tool use at some institutions now augmenting relatively ancient assessment practices, such as oral examinations, in-class assessments, and live demonstrations or presentations. And unfortunately, this also means that some of the remaining elements of flexibility that students had been enjoying since the pandemic have also been summarily abandoned. Just as the ethics of remote exam proctoring tools flew in the face of the fundamental values of academic integrity, I would submit so too does the ethics of using Gen AI detection tools today. For example, these tools produce both false positives and false negatives, which compromise their accuracy and their reliability. They are known to disproportionately disadvantage specific groups of learners, including those for whom English is a subsequent language. And as with commonly used originality checking platforms such as Turnitin, Gen AI detection tools trample over the intellectual property rights of students while actively monetizing their intellectual labor. And they do so while diverting precious institutional resources away from more beneficial supports for educators and students while reinforcing an atmosphere of mistrust. As Sarah Eaton has said, the promise of academic cheating detection software will always fail because cheating is not ultimately a technology problem, it is a human one. And it is these observations and ethical concerns that reflect, I think, frameworks like Eaton's own comprehensive academic integrity framework, as well as things like the Association for Learning Technologies framework for ethical learning technology. They also raise interesting and important questions for future research. Is it that the unauthorized or even the, let's say, the authorized active use of Gen AI for teaching and learning, does it undermine in any way the development of critical AI literacy? Do course policies that appear to be predicated on mistrust of students have a negative impact on student engagement and learning? Are certain kinds of assessments more susceptible to unauthorized use of Gen AI? What factors, if it's disciplinary norms, institutional policies, instructor workload, are most predictive of instructional approaches when it comes to Gen AI and academic integrity? As I've attempted to outline, I think there are several parallels between the experiences and the inclinations of post-secondary educators who have navigated both pandemic pedagogy and the advent of Gen AI over a period of a few short years. And this includes things like a sudden loss of agency, a need to rapidly upskill, a need to redesign assessments to suit a brand new reality, an inclination to impose systems, technological systems, particularly of control and surveillance, an erosion of trust in the classroom, and even an abandonment of ethics at the altar of rigor. And to what end? Unlike the period of emergency remote teaching during the onset of the pandemic, I think Gen AI is certainly going to be an enduring feature of the educational landscape. And further, I think there will be many more changes to come that will challenge normative practice, that will widen inequities, and offer perhaps impersonal and impoverished technological solutions to what are complex human and pedagogical problems. And so, with this in mind, I believe that it is essential for us to absorb and adapt the lessons from the past few years. This includes the paramount importance of accessible course materials, the value of student agency when it comes to things like choice of assignments, flexibility as well with things like deadlines, the learning impact of authentic assessments, the futility of a technological arms race, and of course, understanding and support for digital inequities and learners' diverse contexts, all of which are facets of what Kate Denial describes as a pedagogy of kindness. More broadly, educators, I think, ought to critically reflect on the future that we wish to build in higher education. Is it really one in which students submit to retinal scans, DNA swabs, and voice recognition analyses to establish their identity before writing an in-person exam or a high-stakes oral exam, perhaps? Is it where students can perhaps purchase different levels of access to their learning management system, with higher tiers permitting the revision of coursework after receiving AI-driven feedback? Is it where students are forced to jailbreak their own personal devices in order to avoid being penalized because the surveillance that's baked into the digital textbook platform notices when they do not pause within the optimal range of time for learning? Where students who trigger tripwires set up in the institution's learning analytics logs are automatically funneled into remedial sections and restricted from programs of study that do not already include students like them? Now, if any of this sounds like an episode of Black Mirror, you've perhaps not been paying close enough attention in recent years to everything from the defunding of higher education, the systematic extraction of humanity from the classroom, but also the increasing commodification of learning, the bottom trawling and uncritical processing of learner data, the outsourcing of ethical reasoning to self-interested educational technology vendors, and the inadvertent role-playing, I will suggest, by educators serving now as brokers for surveillance capitalism. Nor do I believe that the blame for the current state of affairs falls to either educators or learners who are part of a much larger ecosystem. For example, whether it is an instructor who is requiring their students to purchase an expensive commercial textbook with an access code that is associated with a publisher's homework platform with auto grading, or if we're talking about a student who purchases access to course content from companies like Chegg or Course Hero, for me, it's easy to understand why overwhelmed instructors and overwhelmed students alike are seeking to locate efficiencies wherever possible. Right? Given that neoliberal systems of higher education also push students to care more about the grade than about their learning, it is not difficult to imagine, folks, students today submitting AI-generated essays that are then auto-graded by AI-driven grading platforms. This is terribly efficient, and it probably represents a Silicon Valley dream, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the business of education. In my view, what will save us from such a nightmarish future for higher education, while at the same time bolstering our resilience to endure the next wave of change, is not falling prey to the techno-solutionism of Silicon Valley, but rather a simple yet radical recentering of humanity. And by this, I do not mean the so-called personalized learning that's driven by faceless algorithms, but instead transformative human-centered learning that values relationships, that values trust, that values care. And this isn't because I disregard the value of technology-enhanced education, but rather, like Seymour Papert, I believe that learning is vastly more powerful when the student programs the computer instead of the computer being set up to program the student. As a critical pedagogue, I draw inspiration from bell hooks, who reminded us that to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. I therefore believe it is vital to ensure that we approach our work as educators with academic integrity by refocusing education on developing critical consciousness, on equipping educators and learners with the skills to confront the challenges of our times, and that includes critical AI literacy today, and of ensuring that we design our learning environments in a way that centers those who currently stand at the margins. In a recent experimental study I conducted with a couple of PhD students at Brock, Oya Pakal and Anita Twill, and Lindsay Gavush from the New England Board of Higher Education, we took a stab at this. We systematically manipulated course policies, course materials, and even course assignments and course syllabi to consider the impact on students' responses, whether it was their intent to register in courses, their sense of perceived belongingness at the university, or even their perceptions of the instructor. As you can see over here across the second row, in the control condition, we really aim to reflect normative practices, such as an expensive commercial textbook with an access code, a traditional research essay, inflexible assignment guidelines. But as we went down the remaining conditions, we began to operationalize elements of social justice, specifically redistributive justice, such as with the use of open educational resources that help alleviate the cost burden for students, recognitive justice, such as by increasing the sociocultural diversity of the curriculum and emphasizing an inclusive classroom environment, and representational justice, such as with including a Wikipedia assignment that's specifically geared towards redressing underrepresented epistemologies. And while this article is still under review, I can tell you that the results showed us that these justice frames were perceptible to students. They led to an increased intent to register, increased feelings of support and acceptance, as measured by subscales of the University Belongingness Questionnaire, and more positive ratings of the instructor. This wasn't just in the case of students with marginalized identities. It was across the board. This was a main effect. The point here is that it is possible to design for justice in ways that take seriously our core mission as educators to widen equitable access, to empower learners, to cultivate critical consciousness, and to lead societal transformation. But this isn't just up to individual educators. Institutions need to play a role here, reshaping the structures, the systems, the strategies in higher education so that we do not continue to see a disconnect between the nice words in our strategic plans and the harsher reality, which too often, in my view, reinforces and replicates existing societal power hierarchies. Whether we are talking about institutional supports for non-traditional learners, like first-generation students who do not, of course, have access to the hidden curriculum, or supports for sessional instructors who, for example, would love to engage in professional development for teaching and learning if this was built into their contracts, if this did not require them to volunteer their time. Institutions need to make sure we align our incentives and our supports. Now, even with something as obviously beneficial as open educational practices, whether students benefit from greater pedagogical flexibility, for students from cost savings, instructors from greater pedagogical flexibility, or institutions from benefits from gains in enrollment and persistence and performance, it is essential to provide support so that people are not swimming against the current to embrace such inclusive teaching practices. This is why, for example, I really appreciate that both Brock and UBC's tenure and promotion criteria recognize the creation of open educational resources, whether as a form of educational leadership, as it is at UBC, or innovative methods of teaching, as it is at Brock. This is why I'm looking forward to the publication of the Ethical Educational Technology Toolkit by the BC Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills, a resource that I've been working on for some time with people across the province, including, of course, CTLT's own Christina Hendricks, and that will provide questions, resources, tools, and guidance to educators, administrators, and institutions. This is why I appreciate the thoughtful work of people like UBC's own Simon Bates, who together with Danny Liu developed the CRAFT model of working with Gen AI in education, where CRAFT stands for culture, rules, access, familiarity, and trust. And of course, this is why we must continue to look to our moral obligation to effectively respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to the principles of the Tri-Council's Dimensions Initiative, and to our commitments as signatories of the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion in Canadian Higher Ed. What I'm trying to say is we know exactly what meaningful change looks like. We just need to implement it. What we need is a more critical, a more inclusive, a more open approach, one that leads with trust of students and trust of faculty. To draw on a wonderful insight from Christina Katopodis, if we're going to talk about rigor, let us ensure we have rigorous standards of flexibility and accessibility. If we're going to talk about academic integrity, let's extend that concept to our own ethics and our own approach to both technology and pedagogy. Let us lead with care, but not forget about self-care. Let us build supports and structures that support humans and that foster humanity. As Kevin Gannon writes in his book, Radical Hope, A Teaching Manifesto, change in higher education can sometimes occur dramatically, but the real work of change in higher education is done students by students, classroom by classroom, course by course. And it's done by educators who have committed to teaching because it and their students matter. We can commit to collective growth, folks. We can embrace meaningful change. But this takes intention. It requires support. It benefits from guidance. And most of all, it necessitates that we never lose sight of what truly matters. And that's caring for the souls of our students. And it is in doing so that I think we will perhaps rediscover our own humanity as well. Thanks very much for listening, folks. I can't wait to hear what your questions or comments might be. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jhangiani, for an interesting and very thought-provoking talk about critical approaches to technology and teaching and learning, about inclusive and equitable practices and collective growth and the challenges with doing that. So really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So we're now moving into the question and answer portion of the session. As a reminder, we have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your questions. And by clicking on that button, you can also see other questions, and you can click the little thumbs up for upvoting the questions that might resonate with you. You have the option to submit your questions with a name or without a name. We ask that all questions remain respectful and on topic to ensure an insightful and engaging discussion for everybody. And our keynote speaker will be reviewing the questions. So I think, Rajiv, you will be going ahead and deciding what to answer, although we're happy to support in any way. And any questions that have been answered will move to the answered tab in the Q&A window. So
thank you, Christina. And perhaps maybe just to take the pressure off as well, I know that was a lot of information and hopefully some thought-provoking ideas.
for sure.
I'd welcome folks to even just reflect and share a comment and an observation. It might be something that others in the webinar also share, but might give us another jumping point for another thought. It's a good question. From Rie number. Will the slides and the resources be shared? Well, I'm glad that you like the frameworks being presented in the slide. And so I know the recording of the session is certainly going to be provided. I'm certainly happy to share, and perhaps it could be included in the notes associated with the recording, a link to the slides as well. So that can come in the next couple of days to our friends at CTLT. But thank you for asking.
Yes, we have a wiki page that will have all the resources from the Celebrate Learning Week that folks are willing to share. So the recording and the slides, I understand, will be posted there.
And thank you very much, anonymous attendee. I really appreciate it. I will match your fire with a heart. I know these are challenging times to be an educator, right? And I think these are many questions that many people have struggled with, but it's also difficult, as I say, for individual educators to contend with these issues without appropriate supports. But at the same time, you want those supports to be thoughtfully designed and not rushed. Right, I'm seeing a question over here from another anonymous attendee. How do you design assessments for that center DEI for accredited program with a class of 110 students? Wow, that's fascinating. So I think one of the things I really appreciate about, I'm going to click answer live. One of the things I really appreciate about this question is it acknowledges yet another force that acts in the classroom that constrains, sometimes steers, it's another hand on the steering wheel, isn't it? Accreditation requirements. You've got your course learning outcomes, you've got your departmental policies, you've got your disciplinary norms, you've got your personal proclivities and preferences, but accreditation can play a role as well sometimes. And so I guess, beyond the question of looking at specific cases, whether it's, nursing programs or engineering programs and which specific case we're talking about, what I would really urge, though, is that we exercise some agency over here. Right? We are members of these disciplines. We have voices that we can exercise. And so if you're working within a discipline where the accrediting agency or body perhaps does not actively look in this direction to supporting more inclusion, would they not want more inclusion and diversity, belongingness in the profession, perhaps? I would really seriously think about rallying around advocacy to change those accreditation requirements and those guidelines, rather than simply trying to figure out how we can squeeze humanity into a set of guidelines that do not appear to reflect the reality in front of us. So I do want to acknowledge that there's more than one way to deal with this, but I think I have a lot of faith in the creativity of educators, whether it's looking at simple pieces around not even high stakes assessments. Sometimes these are required to be awful, invigilated, proctored in some cases, for example. But what signals we're sending? What is our use of formative assessments? Everything from before the term begins, pre-course surveys, the messages and signals you're sending students along the way, your broader flexibilities and guidelines. Are you using, even something like specifications grading, for example, which is one pathway to ungrading without entirely causing too much friction with accrediting agencies? I think there's ways in which you can exercise some agency even within those constraints. But ultimately, I would say, look where you have that agency, and where you can partner with students, perhaps to even look at co-creation. You could always design, a default assignment, but also work with students to look at the option of something different. I always found that working with current students is so rich, and it empowers me to work with future students because they will tell me immediately where the pain points are, where the bottlenecks are, what are the more useful references. I have my students, digitally annotate the pages of the open textbooks that I assign because they're in a much better position to guide future cohorts than I am for some of these issues. So I would look at some of these options, look at the non-regulated forms of assessment, as I said, including formative, look at the agency you have, even if you can have something that's an alternative to the default. But ultimately, I would say we really need to take this moment, because if you're asking this question, you're going to bet that you have colleagues like this as well. And so I think today it's a very reasonable question to ask. And I know there have been some accrediting agencies very recently that have been critiqued very publicly for really not or disallowing movement in the direction of EDI. And so I think a colleague, I don't think it might have been another Canadian university, asked the question out loud. This was a business accreditation for context. And they asked the question about, even as a dean of the business school, if accreditation over here means that we are not implementing and making progress towards EDI, decolonization, perhaps accreditation is not the goal anymore. And so they're actually talking about moving away from that accreditation, which I'm not suggesting is the first approach you take, but I think there's a few parts. But questioning the status quo would be high on the list for me. But thank you for the question. I'm just going in order over here because it's hard to track too far, but I see 10 upvotes. So I want to see how much I appreciate what you had to say. Oh, thank you. Thank you for framing it as bravery. To be honest, I feel very fortunate to hold some positional power at this point, certainly at Brock, and to be able to shape things like our institutional academic plan, which I welcome that you read, because boy, does it have some spice in it. But I do think that those who are furthest from power, pre-tenure faculty, sessional faculty, students in particular, are going to be thinking the same things. I think one of the benefits of, more, well, how do I put this? I think the benefits of providing the kind of approach that I'm talking about means that people with more widely distributed lived experience end up at the leadership table, which is important. Because these, some of these decisions, some of these supports are not designed out of malice at all. It's often about ignorance. And that's why some of these things came to light and the dial moved during the pandemic. But I do think, there's this tension. Who's invited at the table? And there's that old joke around, well, if you're not if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. But I think those who do have that power need to speak. I think it's increasingly recognized. But the other thing I would say is it's important not to leave it to those who are marginalized in various ways in terms of their identities to advocate for themselves. It's a lot of emotional labor and it's a lot more risk. And so, I would encourage folks to look for these broader issues and questions, because if we design for the margins, everybody's looked after. But you don't have to be a person with disabilities in order to fight ableism. And so I think picking up that mantle, whether or not you have those lived experiences, is important. But again, thank you for the kind comment. I shared a number of interesting book titles, lots of Googling. Gosh, yes, Radical Hope by Kevin Gannon is one of my favorites. It might be behind me over here. In fact, it is. Design Justice is a fabulous one. It's not specific to higher ed. It's by Sasha Constanza Schock. Pedagogy of Kindness, Kate Denial's new book, is brilliant. To be honest, there's a lot that I would point to. There's ungrading, I guess what I would really start, though, is I'd have to go back to bell hooks, to be honest. Teaching to Transgress, perhaps, would be or Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because, I think that's really the key bit, is contemporary conversations about technology and new techniques like ungrading are one thing. But the common core is, what is the role of the educator? What are we trying to achieve over here? What are we through higher education? I think those are the core questions. And I think starting with those conversations is important. And that's why I would start with critical pedagogy. Okay. Next question from Michael. Given the increasing integration of Gen AI in both educational and professional settings, how can we advance critical AI literacy in ways that respond to the immediate demands of the workforce? I hear you, while also challenging students to question and reshape power dynamics, biases, ethical concerns. I think this is a really, really important question, and a question not too many people are asking, sadly. So I think, there is this inevitability piece, and you're going to hear this a lot, right? Well, it's already here. It's going to be here. If it's not, it's going to be in everything. Why are you trying to fight it? It's a losing battle. You'll be if you critique it in any way, you'll immediately be called out as a Luddite or something, which is hilarious. But, I think there is some of this. There's surveys of employers who say that, well, some 60+% of employers say that they would rather have a student who's skilled with using Gen AI today than with other skills that we might otherwise expect them to develop at university. And so I would caution us when it comes to these kinds of comments. I think industry, the workplace, and I say this as somebody who oversees not just the Center for Teaching and Learning, but also supports for co-op education, career education, and experiential education, and community-focused programming. It is important to attend to those needs. But to some degree, and I hate borrowing from a valley in Silicon, a leader in Silicon Valley for this, but Steve Jobs was famous for talking about how one of the ways in which he would never design a new device was talking to consumers about what they wanted. That's not the vision over here. I think there's broader questions about what we need to support communities in the short term. There's upskilling that we need to provide. But the bigger question is about where we're going, right? We don't want to make some of the poor decisions that have been made along the way. Like, let's invest in STEM. Let's disregard humanities education. All of a sudden, everybody's looking for people who can think critically and work collaboratively and communicate well. So I think within universities, we can take different approaches. I'm seeing some institutions take an approach of pre-university training, of first-year seminars that are very powerful, that develop a range of university success skills that are led by tenured faculty members, that develop a sense of belonging to the university, develop some skills, whether it's everything from academic integrity questions to baking in that critical AI literacy. I think we can look at degree-level expectations and how we're vertically integrating things across the curriculum. How are we scaffolding these skills along the way where it makes sense? Right. But I think we also have to recognize that technology is going to shift a lot faster than Senate discussions are going to as well. So I think taking a step back again and thinking about the critical skills that we need to equip our students with. We need the workshops, we need the training. We can think about how we can integrate it into the curriculum. But I would still take a step back and say the conversations also need to happen with government, with industry, because there are a lot of people who are going to get carried away with this is what we need to do, right? And I know there's been false comparisons made over the last couple of years in terms of many other kinds of technological developments. Gen AI is not quite like the advent of the calculator. It is not quite like the advent of the internet. It has unique features to it. But at the same time, it is not quite like the promise of the MOOC from 10 years ago, where there will only be 10 universities in the future and all brick and mortar institutions will collapse. So I think looking through the hype cycle, thinking critically about what we actually need to move the dial on, and then thinking about how we can integrate it in a way that's not just piecemeal. And so program level discussions, I would say, together with student supports, this is where I think, BPA, Provost Office need to have some serious conversations as well. But how is it structured? How is it part of the student experience? This is not the only thing that students need to leave university with, but it increasingly is an important one. But at the same time, I think there's some things you can do internally. And having a local tenant, for example, helps deal with some of the privacy issues if you're dealing with, let's say, Copilot on campus, having some very clear guidance when it comes to IP pieces. But, this is a different world. Sarah Eaton from the University of Calgary was at our campus yesterday giving a talk about post-plagiarism. And one of my favorite things she did was in the middle of the talk, she changed her reading glasses and wore this other set of glasses. And the big reveal at the end, and I hope I'm not spoiling it for people because she's been posting about this online, is she revealed that these were AI supported glasses. And so unbeknownst to us, she was reading off a teleprompter. There was a space for exam crib notes in the upper corner. And she noted that those glasses, which cost less than $1,000, now come with prescription lens options. And so you have to think about accessibility accommodations and your inability to disallow such things in the future. So again, increasingly, I think this is not a hold the door moment. It is not an uncritical let it in either. And I think those conversations so that literacy in the community, literacy in business, literacy on government advances, as much as we're making sure that no matter how much the technology keeps evolving while students are with us, that the training and support that we give them starting at the first year is effective enough that they're going to be able to keep pace, and critically so. But I think you're asking in many ways a question that KPMG would probably charge $100,000 to spend an hour talking to you about. It's a great question, Michael. I encourage you to ask that question more. How are we doing for time, Christina?
So we are scheduled to go until noon. So
Perfect.
and we'll have a little bit of a wrap up at the end. So maybe 15
Right.
minutes.
Great. Let's see if we can snag at least a couple more questions over here. Sorry, I'm just scrolling now because boy, the questions have been pouring in. This is what happens when I ramble. It gives people time to write. I'm seeing one that has 4 upvotes. Some nice comments. Thank you for sharing without holding back. Yep. You celebrated the work of teaching and learning centers during both recent crises, yet we are also seeing reduced budgets. Yes, to continue the good work, which leads to an overwhelm of permanent staff. Yes, exactly. So often part-time only, supported by term staff. What are your thoughts on how to convince the institution of the value of centers for teaching and learning as integral bodies to the continued high level of education provided? After all, without CTLs, without good pedagogy, students can't just turn to the internet and large language models to gain pure knowledge and facts. Bless you for writing this question. I think, this is the key bit. And it's fascinating because I think we saw this during the pandemic. There was underinvestment in centers for teaching and learning leading up to the pandemic. And thankfully, many university administrations recognized that, and there was a lot more investment during that time. And some of it has stayed at that level. In some cases, there's been more precarity. And of course, the whole sector is reverberating over here. And so, of course, we're dealing with cuts everywhere. But I think, there's different arguments I would make. And I suppose as an administrator, and I'm sort of smiling over here because I know, I'm imagining what the world that Simon and Christina inhabit looks like at UBC. But in my world, I need to be able to have different conversations using different languages when I need to and make the arguments that I need. So for example, at Brock, we've been very creative about this. We needed to support more inclusive pedagogy. And so when I got to Brock, one of the first things we did is we collaborated with a unit that reports in a different structure entirely, student services. And this is specifically student accessibility services. And What we had was a conversation about pooling shared resources to create a brand new full-time position that was jointly funded. The whole point was if we can work proactively to support inclusive design, in theory, this should lead to a lower volume of reactive accommodation requests. And that's exactly what we've managed to do. We actually managed to steal, perhaps, Anne Gagné from the University of Toronto, and she's, of course, a national leader in the space. She's our senior accessibility and inclusion specialist in our center. But it's efforts like that. I think you can talk about it in terms of workload impact ultimately. You can talk about it in terms of benefiting wider change. Alignment with things like strategic plans, right? If we want a well-chosen blend of delivery modes, if we want to integrate experiential learning, if we want to make sure students are leaving these courses with these skills, with these competencies, we need to provide those supports. And of course, we still, of course, work in a sector where pedagogical training is not required to be a faculty member, as much as I would love for that to be the case. So we can't just work with people who are going to care enough to self-study and upskill that way. There are structural supports that are needed, and it's incredibly powerful. So, whether it's workshops, whether it's teaching squares, whether it's instructional skills workshops, whether it's communities of practice, there are so many arguments you can make in support of pedagogical goals, strategic goals, accreditation requirements. But I would leverage every one of those arguments you possibly can. And where I need to, I would convert some of those arguments into the beans that the people who like counting beans would need to hear, right? And so just as an example, when I was at my former institution, we had a large OER-based zero textbook cost program. And what I would track at the back end was what is the incremental gain in terms of student enrollment in these courses, persistence, performance, and there were gains on all three. And this is not what brings me to this work. I don't care. For me, belongingness is enough, right? I don't need the business case for inclusion. That would make me want to throw up in my mouth. But if somebody needs a business case in order to support the work that is strategically aligned, but that does what we need to in terms of, without getting too romantic, the soul of higher education being preserved, I will make those arguments. So I think you do have to be a bit of a shapeshifter. There is a broad question about strategic alignment and evidence-based practice, and those are easy to wield as levers when you work in centers for teaching and learning, because pretty much everything we do is strategically aligned and is supported by evidence. And so the last thing I would say is the opportunity to shift not just specific questions of teaching and learning, but broader questions about campus culture and community, right? Because there's few spaces on campus that are able to cut across the departmental and faculty politics, like teaching and learning centers, that are able to build community. I was at UBC's celebration of UDL and OER champions a few weeks ago, for example, and it was glorious to see the community and the celebration. And I think it's sending clear signals like that that tell an institution what's rewarded, what's recognized, what's desirable. So by providing these supports, you're not just telling people, if you're going to do this, it's despite the absence of support. No, right? As I said, you need to change the current so people are not swimming against it. And so I think there are many arguments to be made. I completely agree with what you're talking about in terms of the central role of centers for teaching and learning. But I also appreciate that depending on the institutional context, sometimes, you have excluded non-unionized staff. Sometimes it's a lot of unionized. It kind of depends on the institutional model. And I recognize that in this budgetary environment, it's often excluded staff who are even more precarious when there are cuts coming as well. So what I would suggest, of course, is more broadly looking for opportunities to collaborate, which is the other strategy. A lot of what we do is shared goals, right? This is why all of us openly license our resources and guides and workshops and tools, but looking for those opportunities because we can do things together in a way that is more efficient in terms of if you want to look at it from a particular lens. But ultimately, I think increasing those connections also allows us to achieve something much more in terms of not just within your institution, but within the sector. Right. And I recognize that ultimately we often work together and move between institutions as well. So a lot of the work ahead, I think, is going to be difficult, especially when it comes to moving the dial on public appreciation of the value of higher education. And so the more we are able to work together instead of sort of dividing and trying to stand out, I think would be a broader strategy to adopt as a sector. So it's a partial non-answer with some ideas, but I think it's an important question, and I think many of the colleagues on the call who work at CTLs will feel very seen by that comment. So thank you. All right, let me see. I'm scrolling down over here. Oh gosh, I love a couple of questions. Sorry, I'm scrolling down quite a bit. As a junior faculty member, it is really challenging advocating for an inclusive classroom, treating students like humans. Gosh, I feel that in my bones. In a room full of seasoned educators, for example, do you have any advice or guidance? Yeah, and I hate to say it, I don't think you're alone at all. I mean, you hopefully may not be alone even in your department, to be honest, but you certainly won't be alone at the institution or within higher education. Um, I've found community in different ways. Often it comes through, in fact, interacting with centers for teaching and learning. And if there's communities of practice, so you'll find people who share your values. They will often always come from other disciplines and sometimes other institutions. And that's okay. I found these people through articulation committees, through broader events across the community that are, BC Campus puts on teaching and learning events, for example, things like that. So I would say finding that community is important because feeling isolated in this situation is even worse. And so I would say certainly finding that community is going to be an important piece. But I'll share one practical strategy as well. I once worked in a department where, just to give you an example of one practice I wanted to change, they had a standardized, expensive commercial textbook that had been used for, I don't know, 25 years. Nobody was willing to change the practice. I was a relatively new faculty member. I was very interested in using OER, but it was really, really difficult, in part because there was a financial interest. In fact, the department had a contract with the commercial publisher at the time, so that for every copy sold at the campus store, there would be, maybe I shouldn't call it a kickback, but there was some money that went to the department as well. So there was a real disincentive for the department. And so my question was, let's look at this as a research project. What I asked for was sanctioned permission for a pilot. I said, I want to make sure that, if I'm asking my students to spend money on a textbook, that it is worth the money. We all seem to believe it's worth the money. I want to test that option. We're all empiricists. So for me, I leaned into the ideological leaning of the department as we are empirically minded. And so I asked for permission, recruited a couple of colleagues, and for 1 year, just the three, we adopted the text, the open text. Nobody else was permitted to. And a year later, we went back to the department with the data. And at that point, it got a little bit more difficult for people to cling to the commercial text. So we ended up in a situation where anybody who wanted to adopt an open text that wouldn't cost students money was allowed to do so, but those who wanted to adopt a commercial text has to still stick with the one fixed option. So, and it's not a strategy that's going to work in every situation. You would need to be able to have that in. And of course, I was able to recruit a couple of colleagues who were agnostic enough to say, sure, I'm willing to give it a try. They were not the ones who were bending their course to map onto the table of content of a textbook. So it was less onerous for them to switch. But I do think, it's a very, very challenging environment. I mean, I think you obviously have to be attuned to the forces that are upon you. This is like a junior scholar asking, I'd love to publish in a platinum open access journal, but my department TNP committee expects me to publish in this specific journal over here, which is a terrible journal for a variety of reasons. When you are in those tenure and promotion committees, you make those changes, right? This is what I'm saying. This is the time to advocate to accreditation bodies. So I don't think that those who are furthest from power should be the ones to lead that change. I think you need to make sure you are not sacrificing yourself at this stage, because what you are going to bring to your students just by adopting and embracing inclusive practices that you can embrace is going to be life-changing for many of them. So I would say do it in ways that you're safe to now. Find community and try and find inroads, even if it's sanctioned pilots or inviting guest speakers, organizing a symposium that talks about this, focusing on whatever path you think will make sense. Pointing to other universities that perhaps are peer institutions that have embraced similar practices and learning from them. But look for where you've got these openings. And if you have the opportunity, of course, again, engage with folks at the CTL because sometimes it's a lot easier for departments, even senior department members, to say yes to something if someone like the provost, someone like the vice provost teaching and learning, someone like the dean of the faculty have clearly signaled that this is valued, this is important. That makes it easier. And so look for those supports. But uh, I do think you need to also look out for yourself over here because it certainly sounds to me like you're going to change the lives of thousands of educators. And I certainly wouldn't want you to fall on a sword at this early stage as well. But I really, really hear you, and I appreciate you asking the question. Um, all right, so much to choose from. Christina, do you want to pick one? I feel like we have spoiled for choice over here.
Let's see. Um, well, the one with the most upvotes at the moment is thanks for the talk. Sometimes it feels that changing pedagogical motives needs student buy-in. Students are busy and they feel comfortable with minimal change. How do you work towards justice without rocking the boat? How do you encourage creativity that some instances of AI allow and maintain integrity?
Yeah, I love the question. Yeah, it's another one of those interesting tensions. I was in a really great conversation yesterday, and perhaps this will mirror the spirit of this question is, when I work in open pedagogy, we often talk about infusing student agency into the learning environment in a number of ways, democratizing the learning experience, right? But the reality, of course, is that agency is something that is unusual for many students. It really stands out if you're co-creating course policies with students, if you're giving them lots of options with assignments. And so, agency doesn't have to mean an entire lack of structure. And you can think about some structure and some agency, which helps with this. Culturally as well, right? I grew up in India, and that education system is a lot about memorization and regurgitation. And so being encouraged to speak in the classroom, you might see this with international students early in their journey in Canada, if they're coming from India, for example, really reticent to raise your hand. It's disrespectful. You're taking up the space of the instructor. You don't have authority and knowledge. There's reasons why people don't engage in that way, and it's for cultural reasons. So I guess what I'm saying is there's lots of good reasons why people won't engage, why students will prefer more structure instead of more agency, why students will prefer a more, no, I want the sage on the stage. I want you to just talk to me right now. I don't want to be in all of these activities, even though many of us on the call will know the research on the power of active learning when it comes to our long-term learning as well. So, I think part of it is respecting that. And so I like that combination of structure and agency. So, whether it's elements where you invite co-creation, where you have a default, but there's other ways to do it, even with UDL, right? Multiple means of action and expression. So I think structureless is difficult. All and exclusive hard pressed structure is also difficult. And there's a lot of space in between. And so I think where students, if they're able to exercise their creativity, of course, you typically see so much pride and energy and effort that's poured into assignments, right? And I say this because when I moved away from in-class presentations to the creation of instructional videos, for example, students loved it. They were so creative. Some animated, some did it on iPhones in different places. They had so much fun with it. When I moved away from research essays to Wikipedia assignments, the amount of time students would spend on it because they realized that their scholarship was actually going to be meaningful and read by far more people than just me, the instructor. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you can find a way to ultimately infuse a sense of this is meaningful, so that's the authenticity of authentic assessments, right? So if you inject that sense of authenticity and meaning into your learning activities and learning assessments, um, and look at that balance, watch that balance between structure and agency. I think you have a lot of room to play over there in a way that keeps your students comfortable and gives them as much structure as they want. But yeah, I think this is a huge conversation, and depending on where you want to go. But I think this is not just the case with AI, of course. But with AI, of course, as with other forms of open pedagogy, if you want to extend it in that direction, it still presupposes if I want my students to edit Wikipedia, there's some skill training, some literacy that's required before you start editing live in Wikipedia. You need to know how to do this, perhaps in a sandbox in the LMS or something else. So similarly, maybe you scaffold along the way with the institutional Copilot instance and other things. Put some guardrails around it. Maybe iterative assignments. So you're building on one to the next, so it's not entirely from scratch as well. But I think this is part of the fun and the joy and the creativity as an educator as well. So I suppose I would just encourage conversations with students, you know, from early on in the course. And if there are ways in which they can get used to exercising the agency in small ways leading up to it, even it's from, choices of course policies or schedules of work or other things, right up onto, the nature of major assessments. I think we can help students get more comfortable with discomfort. And in some ways, that's part of our job.
All right, I think we will need to leave it here. I know there's a lot of other really fantastic questions in the Q&A, and I'm very sorry that we are out of time, but we're only scheduled to go for another few minutes. So I do want to say thank you so much to Rajiv for an engaging and incredibly thought-provoking talk. You've shared so many really important insights and ideas from your deep experience in teaching and learning, and also in the post-secondary sector and in your leadership role. So there's been a lot of appreciation shared in the Q&A, which I also share. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Christina. This was a treat. Anytime UBC needs me, just give me a call. But I really
Wonderful.
appreciate the engagement and the questions, folks. I think we're all in this together.
Thanks so much. So I'll just have a few closing thoughts here. I also want to thank all of the participants for joining us today and for the incredible questions that helped us go a bit further into many of the topics that Rajiv talked about. So thanks so much. And thank you to the wonderful, amazing CTLT event staff for their very helpful support in planning and facilitating this, and indeed many other sessions during Celebrate Learning Week. And there's also an amazing group of people who've been involved in planning for Celebrate Learning this year across both campuses. So thank you to those folks as well. I invite you to peruse the schedule for the rest of Celebrate Learning Week to consider attending more events. I think we're going to post some into the chat. Thank you so much, Rachel. So we have a leadership panel coming up on Thursday, connecting within and across campuses, fostering collaborations that support meaningful change. That's Thursday at noon. We have a faculty panel coming up tomorrow, cross-faculty collaborations, innovations for cultivating growth. That's May 7th at 11:30. And the UBC Okanagan keynote, Learning in a Time of Abundance with Dave Cormier, who's the Interim Director of Curriculum Development and Delivery at Open Learning Thompson Rivers University. So that's on Friday, May 9th at 9 a.m., also online. So you can see a complete schedule of Celebrate Learning Week. I think there it is. Look at that. Rachel's amazing. Thank you so much. It's in the chat. So thanks again to Rajiv. Thanks again to everybody for attending. And I hope you are able to join us for more Celebrate Learning Week events. Thanks so much.